In this lesson, we're going to be talking about virtual machines. You're probably familiar with virtual machines. I mean, they really have taken off in the last few years, and some of that has to do with the fact that there is now hardware on personal computers that supports virtualization. Now, virtualization as an idea has actually been around since the mid-1960s when IBM did research indicating that they could actually run several instances of operating systems on the same hardware platform. Now, when the personal computer came around, we really had this idea of the PC and the operating system were sort of one, and one PC meant one operating system. And now we're really moving away from that idea, and we're getting to a point where we recognize on a wider level that you can actually have multiple operating systems running simultaneously on one piece of hardware. So right here I've got a piece of software called Parallels, and it runs under the Mac, and I'm going to just show you some of the things about virtual machines. So I've got this virtual machine here, and what I'm doing is I am simulating a different piece of hardware that this Linux operating system is going to run in the middle of, or run inside. So I'm going to show you the configuration for this. Now, I've got a physical piece of hardware, and then on top of that, I've got a piece of software that is presenting hardware to the operating system. And when the operating system runs, it sends its instructions to this piece of software. So where normally the instructions would go to the CPU, now we've got a piece of software that's actually intercepting those and figuring out what to do with them based on what they are. And in some cases, if it's interacting with the hardware, the software, in this case Parallels, is going to handle those instructions. In other cases, it's just going to hand them off directly to the CPU to run. So I've got a bunch of hardware here, and with Parallels or with any other type of virtual machine software, I've got the ability to make some changes to the hardware to accommodate particular needs I may have. So I've got the option to do video here, and I can change my video memory depending on what I'm going to be doing with the virtual machine. So let's say I want to install Windows as an example and do gaming for Windows inside this virtual machine. I probably want much more video memory than just 32 megabytes. So I could scale this up, and of course I can enable 3D acceleration, and I could enable vertical synchronization as well. And again, these different options would be based on what my particular needs were. Now, I could install a floppy disk if I wanted, and one of the things about having a virtual machine is, rather than a physical piece of hardware, I could actually present a file to the virtual machine, and that file could present itself as a piece of hardware. Right here we've got this file called floppy.fdd, which is going to present itself as the floppy disk. Now, the same thing for a CD here. I've actually got an ISO file, and right now my CD-ROM's not connected, but I could have the CD be this ISO file rather than having it use the physical CD or DVD drive in my computer. And actually, my computer doesn't actually have a CD-DVD drive at the moment. So what I could do is have it use an ISO file. And there's an ISO file. Here's another one right here. I could pick any ISO file and have the virtual machine present that as the CD-ROM, and it would be just as if I had a physical CD of that ISO image, and I had installed that or inserted that into a CD or DVD drive. So I've got the ability to be pretty flexible about what I'm presenting to the virtual machine. One of the nice things about using these ISOs is I can really change them quickly on the fly without having to eject a CD and then fumble around with physical CDs. if I had a number of ISOs loaded onto my host operating system's hard drive, I could switch those out pretty easily. I've got one hard drive that I have created here, which is the primary hard drive for this operating system, and you'll see I've actually created a couple of other hard drives. That was really to demonstrate the RAID capabilities of Linux. So I've got these two additional hard drives, and at the moment inside the operating system, they are installed as a RAID array. Now, of course, I could destroy that RAID array and I would just have two additional hard drives. Now, you'll see when I go to hard drive 1 and hard disk 2 and hard disk 3, I've got 3 different files. And again, that comes down to the fact that all of this data is actually stored as a file. There's no physical hardware underneath the virtual machine here. Of course, eventually it's stored on a physical hard drive, but it's actually a file that's being presented to the virtual machine, and that file is actually being a hard drive, or looks like a hard drive, to the operating system inside the virtual machine. Now I've got a network controller, and I can change how I'm connected. So in this particular computer, I've got a wireless adapter, which is the one that's selected now, and I've also got an Ethernet adapter. So I could change from the airport adapter, the wireless adapter, to the Ethernet adapter if I were to plug into that. So I can change how I connect. I could also do host-only networking, which means that the only system that my virtual machine would be able to communicate with is the host operating system that the virtual machine is running inside of. So there's definitely some advantages there if you want to do some analysis, like maybe you want to do malware analysis, for example. You could load up this virtual machine, flip it on to host-only networking, and that way you are sure to contain the communication stream from the piece of malware into just this host, where you may not be susceptible to the particular piece of malware. So let's say I'm looking at a piece of Linux malware and I'm running it inside a Mac OS system, or I'm looking at a piece of Windows malware, and again, I'm running it inside a Mac OS system. The fact that I can only see the host operating system is actually beneficial, because the operating system from the host is not susceptible to the piece of malware that I'm looking at. So I've got a sound controller, and I can change the inputs and outputs for that. And in this case, I've got a webcam, and now I could actually add additional pieces of hardware here. So I could add another network adapter, I could add another CD, DVD drive, I could add another hard disk. So there's a lot of capabilities here that I can configure the virtual hardware in a way that it would look exactly the way I wanted it to look inside this operating system. So now I could start this operating system up, and you will see eventually we'll get the BIOS screen, which just flipped by. And now it's actually booting the operating system. So it looks exactly like a PC does. So when I'm booting up a PC, I get the same screen. I get that BIOS screen. And then eventually we get into the operating system bootloader, which is what should be going on at this point. Now, while this is booting up, I'm going to show you another type of virtual machine. So right now, I am actually logged into a Linux system, and Linux has a piece of virtualization software called KVM, and I can get into KVM now, and I could actually look at the virtual machines I'm running just via the command line, which is kind of nice sometimes. So I can list my virtual machines here, and it looks like I've got one. And I can take a look at that one virtual machine, and you can see that it's actually running. It's got one CPU. I've got memory installed. Looks like I've got about a gig of memory, and I've got auto start disabled. You can see all of the different pieces of information about that particular virtual machine. Now, there's a lot of things that I can do inside here, like I could create a snapshot, for example, and I could do things like network configuration. So I could stop a network, I could list the networks that I've got here, so I could do like a net list, and it looks like I've got one network, it's the default, and it's active, and I can auto start it. But I could create an entire network inside KVM and be able to add hosts to that network, and I could route in between them. So there's a lot of different capabilities with KVM, and it works pretty much the same as any other type of virtualization software like Parallels or VMware. It's just that it runs under Linux, which gives me the ability to do command line manipulation of it, which again sometimes is helpful because I may be logged in via a network remotely, and doing the graphical stuff may just be too slow. Now, there is a graphical interface as well, and I could get into that, and I could pop open the console from there. That's the downside to here, is I can't actually look at the console to a Windows operating system, for example, or any other graphical operating system from inside this command line interface. Now, going back here, so now I've got my Linux system, and it's running inside of my Mac OS system. And I can just bring this up here, and you can see all of the hardware here. I've got my CD drive that I could open up, and I've got the file system that I could open, and you can see all of the files in the file system. So virtual machines give us a lot of abilities to have multiple operating systems running. So again, I've got this Mac OS system that I run Linux and Windows inside of, and I can actually have all three operating simultaneously and have the three of them interact pretty cleanly with one another in terms of sharing files back and forth, which is really helpful. So that's just some basics on virtual machines, and we'll get into a little bit more detail in additional lessons.